Hi, I'm Malcolm Clemens Young, the Dean of Grace Cathedral. Welcome to the Forum Online. We're glad to see you tonight. Martin Luther King Jr. was an American Baptist minister and activist who became the most visible spokesman and leader in the American civil rights movement, living in memory and influence long after his death. Thich Nhat Hanh is a Vietnamese Buddhist monk, peace activist, and historically recognized as the main inspiration for mindfulness and engaged Buddhism. In his new book, Brothers in the Beloved Community, Bishop Marc Handley Andrus tells the little-known story of the friendship between these two giants of our time. The day after King was assassinated in 1968, Nhat Hanh wrote a heartbroken letter to a mutual friend. He said, "They killed my hope. I do not know what to say. He made so great an impression in me. This morning, I have the impression that I cannot bear the loss." Only a few years earlier, Nhat Hanh wrote an open letter to King as part of his effort to raise awareness and bring peace in Vietnam. There was an unexpected outcome of that letter. The two men met and became not only allies in the peace movement, but friends. This friendship between two prophetic figures from different religions and cultures, from countries at war with one another, reached a great depth in a short period of time. The two men connected over a vision of the beloved community, a vision described recently by Congressman John Lewis as, quote, "a nation and world society at peace with itself." It was a concept that King had been popularizing through his work for some time. Nhat Hanh took the lineage of the beloved community from King and carried it on after his death. Bishop Marc is the 8th bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of California. His leadership is focused on key issues related to peace and justice, including immigration reform, civil rights for LGBTQ+ persons, healthcare, and climate change. Each year, the cathedral chooses a theme for inspiration and reflection, and in 2021, our theme is healing. Tonight, we'll be talking about King and Nhat Hanh's friendship and the healing potential of the beloved community. Bishop Marc, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's such a pleasure to see you. I couldn't resist texting you as I was reading through the book, and it was so moving to me. I just feel like it's like such an important contribution to our understanding of these two extraordinary figures. I think I've mentioned before that reading a biography of Martin Luther King Jr. is part of what inspired me to become ordained. And Thich Nhat Hanh too has been a huge force in my understanding of spirituality. But I wonder if you can take us through a little bit. I mean, it's a remarkable breakthrough to recognize the friendship and the connection between these two historic figures. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how you made this discovery.
Thanks, Malcolm. I do remember the influence that the Reverend Dr. King had on you, and I love that, because that's what these two people in their separate spheres have done with millions of people, is inspire them. And for me, I think I was already devoted to both of them, but I didn't know that they knew each other at all. So I had started reading Thich Nhat Hanh in 1991 with his book, Peace is Every Step. And I'd heard him speak in Washington, D.C. Twice, once at National Cathedral and once at Washington Hebrew congregation. Both these vast spaces fill 5,000 people each time, and this small monk keeping us completely wrapped the whole time. And then when I became the bishop suffragan, like the auxiliary bishop of Alabama, I walked into the opportunity to learn so much about the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, because veterans of that movement were still there. And I availed myself of that opportunity and learned from some of these great people. And we had this pilgrimage in Lowndes County, which was called Bloody Lowndes during the civil rights movement, because of how many Black Americans had been brutalized and murdered there. And this pilgrimage honored Jonathan Daniels, who went to Episcopal Theological Seminary, where you took courses in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And he was martyred in 1965 in Hayneville, the county seat there. The last guest I had come preach at that pilgrimage was Congressman John Lewis. And in his sermon and in his teaching with the young people we had involved, he talked about the beloved community, a term I had never heard before. So these two strands were in my life, but they were running parallel to each other. They hadn't intersected. And it was in a course with Drew Dellinger, who was teaching at CIIS, California Institute of Integral Studies, where I did my doctoral work. And he mentioned this, that they had known each other, that they had supported each other. Drew wrote his own dissertation on the cosmological aspects of King's work and what he called Dr. King's mountaintop years from 1965 through his death in 68. Well, once I heard this, it was like huge lights going off in my consciousness, because suddenly these two parallel figures of such great importance to me had come together. And I wanted to know more about that. So I started researching it from there.
Yeah, it's so interesting to think of just, I mean, in some ways, at that moment that you described it, I thought of, I mean, just there's a way in which kind of a shared element of our spirituality in Northern California is being a place which brings together the East and the West. And I think that's one of the most powerful elements of what you're doing. It's you're really going over boundaries that we usually accept as being determinative, and that's one of the things I really love about what you're doing. And another thing that I just think is really revolutionary too is the idea of the beloved community having kind of a lineage, like in the Buddhist, in the way that Buddhist tradition is passed down. And I thought that was so, I think it's so important for different religions to learn from different religious ideas, but that idea of lineage is, I think, like a really important part of your thesis. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that and just how you came to recognize there's a lineage for this beloved community.
Yeah. That's great. Well, Malcolm, you as a academic, you probably have an idea of your lineage. You have an idea about not only your major professor, but the lineage that major professor was in, and you are you probably have a sense that they handed this off to you.
I totally do. Harvey Cox, Gordon Kaufman, Richard Niebuhr. Harvey had Harvard professors who I know, and Gordon and Richard had H. Richard Niebuhr. So I never met H. Richard Niebuhr, but I mean, he's my favorite theologian of the 20th century because all the theologians who taught me were his students. Exactly.
So this idea of the beloved community, as you know, Martin Luther King Jr. Did his PhD at Boston University, and there was a lineage that he was part of with personalism there, and people have really worked to try to connect through the academic path, the scholar's path, Josiah Royce, who coined the term beloved community, and Martin Luther King Jr., and they've just never exactly been able to do that. And I didn't do that either, but I decided to go a different route. And that was more affective and in the world of justice work and action, if you will, and spiritually. And so it was different than his intellectual lineage. And once you're talking about a spiritual lineage, you really are in the realm where the Buddhist practice understands this, that one receives a transmission from your teacher, and it's not conveyed primarily through texts, but rather through the quality of life that's handed to another person. And that is what I think happened with King, because this labor activist and minister, A.J. Muste, there was a spark that came from Royce to him, because it was Royce wrote his famous book, The Problem of Christianity, where he names the beloved community as the kingdom of God in 1913. And so it's just on the eve of World War I. And the Fellowship of Reconciliation, Musty was an early president of that, leader of that, former of that. It begins in 1914 in England and in 1915 in the United States, and beloved community, it shows up immediately. So there was a point of contact there, but then it's very clear the transmission from one person to the next of this, from Musty to the great Howard Thurman, from Howard Thurman to Martin Luther King Jr., from Martin Luther King Jr., who actually spoke this to Thich Nhat Hanh in Geneva in 1967. And then, as you know, I argue that Thich Nhat Hanh has done something really beautiful, which is no longer does he think of it as transmission to one or a few people, but rather that it becomes his spiritual bequeathment to all of us. So that he has this idea that Maitreya Buddha, the Buddha of the future, will arrive not as a single person, but as the Sangha, the body of the faithful, the practice, people who practice and live in community with each other. And at the same time, he said, like the Dalai Lama, that he is not going to have a single successor. So if you put these together, and his idea about the beloved community, it's like he's giving it to all of us, which is this enormous gift. And it's this giant responsibility that we have to live, not only like I'm holding the beloved community as a precious transmission, but that we are holding it together. And so the responsibility is for us to relate to each other as if we're each holding an understanding of this transmission.
One of the things I love most about what you described too is just like it's an evolving tradition. And I love that too, because in a way, I mean, like my experience of the beloved community is through you. Like you're part of my lineage when it comes to the beloved community. Your contribution to me has been this idea of a lineage that is not just something that belongs to one person, but something that happens over time. And I love the way that you point out the ways that Thich Nhat Hanh has evolved the tradition. There may have been shortcomings of the old concepts of the beloved community that didn't recognize the importance of including women or the importance of including all beings in the planet. And that is part of its nature too.
Yeah, so that's exactly right, Malcolm. The people each who receive this transmission, it's not a static thing, just like Christian tradition, right? We are, if it's living, it's going to evolve, and it's definitely living. So King had made his own incredible contributions. He emphasized love. He emphasized reconciliation and nonviolence, and in this as tools to repair the beloved community. And he added this kind of incredible the public witness of public protest, and carried this out and took it outside the walls of the church into the streets and into partnership with all kinds of secular people. It was a church movement in many ways, but it was also a movement that just broke those boundaries. So the beloved community suddenly wasn't about the kingdom of God as Christian or as even avowedly religious in any sense, but was suddenly the heritage of all life. And as you say, Thich Nhat Hanh really took this in some amazing. So the civil rights movement of the 50s and the 60s in this country was heavily criticized by people like the great Ella Baker as being heavily male dominated. And there were, of course, tremendous civil rights leaders who were women. And, one was just with us here in the
Right,
Diocese of
Ruby
California,
Sales.
Ruby
Yeah.
Sales, but there was Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer. And, the list is actually pretty large.
Loretta Scott
But
King herself.
absolutely. And I spend some time on her in the book, but that's not where the attention is. And that's not who had this primary leadership of the movement as far as the public presence of it. So Thich Nhat Hanh started ordaining women monks nuns in Vietnam in the 60s. I mean, really a trailblazer in gender equality. And he's continuing that today at the age of 95, after his stroke, after all that. One of these young nuns said to me in 2019 when I was there, I think she's probably between 17 and 20, a very young person. And she said, I'm honored to be here as Thai, the more intimate name they use for him, as Thai is conducting a revolution without words, meaning continuing the work of gender equality. And so the tradition has evolved. And part of it too is the openness that Thich Nhat Hanh had, which sent him into a kind of curious, wondering quest to understand Christianity. And this is very different than some of the great Buddhist leaders of our time. He really wanted to empathetically understand ideas like Eucharist, and Christmas was observed at Plum Village, and he's written about that. And one of his really famous books is Jesus and Buddha as Brothers. And one of his favorite sayings to me was this. He said that I feel that I know Jesus and Buddha better than many people who walked the earth with them. And he said, the reason for that is I visit them every day. And that really moved me. And I suddenly felt when I read that, oh, that's me. That's I. I visit both Thich Nhat Hanh and King every day, and I visit Jesus and Buddha every day. So this idea of the lineage is interesting because it also is not dead with respect to those who have handed it to us, who have transmitted it to us. And that's one of the major pieces of this story, is that Thich Nhat Hanh really understands Martin Luther King as being a great saint, a great bodhisattva, and that his life continues in a real way after his assassination in April of 1968, that he continues to help him and to help me and to help us. That's what great bodhisattvas do, is they've taken a vow to help all of life be liberated, and they don't ever stop with that vow. And so he believes that about King. And interestingly, I was virtually at an event where Heidi works at USF, honoring a great nonviolent practitioner of today, David Hartsaw. And David, when he spoke, he talked about having the experience of King years after King's death, putting his hand on David's shoulder and encouraging him. And he said it was real. And I thought, oh, this is exactly what Thich Nhat Hanh has experienced, that these great luminous beings of our tradition of Christianity and of Buddhism and of other traditions continue to do their beneficent work to help us.
That was one of my favorite parts of the book, by the way. I don't know who else is telling me that. Like, you're the only one I can think of. And I had a conversation with Harry Edwards, who's a famous sociologist, activist. And, in his book, he talks about the assassination of Martin Luther King, almost in terms of just like, well, that just proves that nonviolence doesn't work. kind of. It
Oh,
didn't
wow.
quite say that, but that was like the tenor of the times, and the idea that people that speak words that are so moving to us, like continue on in our life,
Yeah,
is just
continue
very
on and on.
reassuring to me.
Me too.
Yeah, it's hugely important to me because I do feel the same thing myself. You've studied so much of Buddhism in the last like 15 years. I wonder if you can talk about any new things that you learned or things that surprised you, or just kind of like what that world opened up for you as you studied this material so carefully.
Well, it's it's new to me, to a deep Buddhist practitioner, or maybe to a more casual one. I think the things that I learned wouldn't be groundbreaking in any way. But the way I was taught Buddhism at university and afterwards is that Hinduism had a transmission of a soul, from one life to another, reincarnation, and that Buddhism didn't. The way it's described is that Buddhism had patterns of energy that they recognize, and that energy, as we know from physics, the energy never dies, but it transmutes. And that's kind of like the idea of life after death for the Buddhists. So this very idea that a bodhisattva continues to be a beneficent force working in the phenomenal world where you and I are, it was startling to me. And I really took it as so that was a kind of research question when Thich Nhat Hanh in 2014 made this statement about how Martin Luther King Jr.'s death had affected him. And then he said, at that moment, he made a deep vow to continue what Martin called the beloved community. And he said, I have kept that vow to this day, and I believe I have felt his support. And I thought there's so much in that statement, and I need to ask some questions about it. Like, how has he kept his vow? Like, in what way did he keep this vow to maintain the beloved community? And then how did he feel his support? What does that mean? So if I have, documents, love letters from, somebody from my beloved who, or my parents, and I can go back and read those, I can feel like they're giving me a message even still to this day, things like that. But I wondered if he meant more than that, if he meant that there was a living force that was still supporting him. And when I came to conclude that was true, that was startling to me. And a new aspect to Buddhism that was something I had made a mental concept to not believe. And then suddenly it seemed like there was this convergence between Christian thought there with our honoring of the saints as a living cloud of witnesses, and this work of the bodhisattvas. They're not the same thing, but they're also not different.
Right. I love that. It's a great comparison. I wonder how has Thich Nhat Hanh and the people in his community, how have they responded to the work that you've done? Like, what do they say about all this?
Well, that's a very good question. As I said, I went to Vietnam in 2019, and they couldn't have been, especially the nuns. That's where I spent most of my time. So he returned, Thich Nhat Hanh returned to Hue, the old imperial city where he became a monk at the age, young adolescent at 14. And so he's back in that monastery where he was a boy, and then where he became a young man and studied. But next door, there's also now a convent of nuns, and it's led primarily by a woman, Sister Chang Kang, and she has been his closest associate, and he has called her a great bodhisattva, and she's there, and she was so welcoming to me. And Sister Di Nim, who is kind of in charge of Thich Nhat Hanh's medical care. Her medical degrees from here at UCSF.
Great.
UCSF.
Good care.
And she's a great Buddhist practitioner and teacher too. So they couldn't have been more welcoming. And I spent every day with them, going through the rounds of their day, walking meditation with them. And Thich Nhat Hanh joined us one morning. He's in a wheelchair, but he asked to come, and I was allowed to walk beside him. But every day we would start at 5:30 in the morning with some chanting, and then walking meditation, and then we had breakfast, and then we do work. Everybody, like raking and cleaning out the lily ponds and so on, and then lunch, and and so on. And I just spent my time with them. In the afternoons, these great Buddhist women leaders gave me just enormous amounts of time. I think I probably recorded 15 hours of interviews with them. So they were extremely welcoming, and I feel really blessed by that.
Yeah, that is really great. I mean, because it helps so much, the book. That's one of my favorite things too, is like, basically you take that experience, your personal experience in Vietnam, and I felt like there's so many parallels. I love the way that for you, the civil rights movement is not just about heroic individuals, but like a community of people. And so talking about the women who we may not have heard very much about, but who are important civil rights leaders, that was a really important part of your book too, which I just don't think we would have read if it had been a book written in the 80s, for instance.
Probably not.
As you're studying all this, I wonder if you and Martin Luther King were to spend an afternoon together, like what kind of questions would you have for him? Because there's probably so many things you're like, I wish I had a letter about this, or I wish he'd spoken about this in one of his sermons, or so what things are missing? What would you talk to him about if you had that chance to really ask him questions?
I have not asked myself that question, and I love that question. So I haven't studied a response to it, but the very first thing that comes to me, and I think you will resonate with this because you work hard at it too, is about preaching.
Right. I have zillions of preaching questions.
I would really like to talk with him about that and listen to him. He took at Crozier in Pennsylvania, which is no longer there, and it got folded into other seminaries. But he took some crazy number of
like between 6 and 8 or something.
Yeah, I mean, I can't even quite grasp that. And I, as you know, I did a little research. I looked at the Harvard and Yale, and like none of us take more than 2. And that's a lot in many of the seminaries of mainline Protestantism. He took so many, and his grounding in scripture, and then what he does with that as he moves it through all these patterns. There's material that I read where he and the other students at Crozier are talking about, I use the rocket method, where it's kind of a build up and then it takes off, and they had all these methods of preaching. So I'd love to learn about that. I would love to learn. Just last week, I started looking at the gospel for this coming Sunday, and I realized that this one verse this one quotation, which I'm very taken with, in his Nobel Peace Prize, where he talks about the suffering that they were experiencing then. And so I would invite us to think about the suffering that we're experiencing in the world right now. And I, in the book, as you know, I talk about everything that had happened, many of the things that had happened terrible in his life in 1963, the assassinations and the bombings and the jailings and so on. And so he stands up in front of this august group in Oslo, and he makes this speech, and in it he talks about, metaphorically, about all the terrible things that are happening. He says, these are the birth pangs of a genuine civilization struggling to be born. And I just thought, what a daring, incredible religious imagination that can see all the worst things happening as birth pangs, like something, we're going through this, but something productive is going to come out of this. And I realized this is probably from the Gospel of Marc, where in this week's gospel, as you know, Jesus is saying, all these predictions about the suffering of the time, and he says, but these are the birth pangs. And so it's probably what he was thinking about. So he grounded so much in scripture, and then he had all this way of catalyzing it into a sermon. And Ruby Sales said to me when we were preparing for her to be helping us in the diocese here this past summer, when we were talking, I said something about his speech at Riverside Church, his Beyond Vietnam speech, which is so important, and in which he makes an oblique reference to Thich Nhat Hanh. And she stopped me and she said, "Marc, it was a sermon." He didn't give speeches, he gave sermons.
Yeah, right.
And I was like, okay, I'm revising that. It was at church, it was at Riverside Church, it was Martin Luther King. He was a Christian minister, he was a preacher. As he said, he was a preacher, the son of a preacher, the grandson of a preacher.
Yes.
Yeah, it was a sermon. So I think that's what I would, I could easily listen to him talk about that whole process, because he changed America with his sermons.
Oh, completely. And we still, we know, the words are still with us.
Absolutely.
Yeah. When we talk about a mountaintop experience, it will always have resonances of Martin Luther King.
Yeah, that last sermon he preached.
Yes.
The night before his assassination.
Yeah. Has it changed how you preach, do you think?
I hope so. I hope so. I do, Parallax Press, the publisher, asked me a series of questions about the book. And one of them was that, how has it changed your preaching? And it wasn't precisely from Dr. King, but it was at the same time. But it came from my work, by being a student at CIIS, and Brian Swim, in his work in Thomas Berry's great book together, The Universe Story, they say that the greatest desire of the universe is to connect.
Yeah.
And I have really taken that to heart in my preaching. So it's not about the ideas. It's not about even really so much as the content, as it is about being willing to connect as a real living human being with who I am, with the people who are there, to be in that worship service, for all of us to be changed together. And so that recognizing that is the deepest desire of the universe, well, it changes what you do, right? It's like, I'm not here to get a point across. I'm not here to argue with people. I'm not here to change their minds, or I'm here to do what the universe wants to do, which is to connect. And Margaret Barker, the Hebrew scripture scholar in England, says that this is the central channel of thought of the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament, is the oneness of coming into oneness. That this is the message of the angels. This is the deep dream of God. This is what Jesus wanted. And of course, in the Gospel of John, he prays to God and says, make them one, as you and I are one. And so that's a stunning idea, that the central channel of thought in the scriptures for Christians, Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament, is this desire to connect, to be one. So, yeah.
So I have a suggestion for you for your next project. This is like, you're probably should be on your victory lap because you just got this wonderful book published. But when you described that conference that Thich Nhat Hanh and Thomas Merton and Martin Luther King would have been at, I would have loved to hear your play.
At Gethsemane.
You wrote a play about what that would have been like.
Oh, that's a beautiful
Because
idea.
you're the one who knows now, and all the stuff, it's fresh for you, and no one knows this material like you do, and you won't know it like you do right now forever.
Well, that's interesting, because Vincent Harding was invited to that too.
Yeah.
You mean at Gethsemane Abbey? So the cast would have been pretty interesting, right?
Yes.
It would have been Thomas Merton was the host.
Yeah.
And Vincent Harding, Thich Nhat Hanh. I don't remember if there may have been one more person, but it was to be April. of 1968, and just a couple of weeks after what came to be King's assassination. That's a beautiful thing. There is one person who has done a piece that's imaginative about that. What would they say? I can't think of who he is now, but that's a really beautiful idea. You know, Owsley Brown and several people who really see how important Merton is in our religious landscape, want to expand the story more. And although I talk about Merton some in the book, and Berrigan too, who was very important to Thich Nhat Hanh, and vice versa. Yeah, I kept my focus on these two, but telling that story, backing up as you're suggesting, and bringing Vincent Harding into it. We don't know Vincent Harding well enough. He was so important, and it was he who helped me see Dr. King in a new light. In Birmingham, he spoke. Vincent spoke at an annual breakfast honoring Dr. King on Martin Luther King weekend on the holiday. And he had a small book out called, it's not the exact title, but basically King, the Inconvenient Hero. And the point was that as he lived in what he called the world house more, like as he lived a bigger life, and he never gave up. This is what's hard for people, all of us, to see, because we're so dualistic. He never gave up his commitments to civil rights, but he kept expanding the frame so that it was about global poverty and the Poor People's Campaign itself, and peace.
Vietnam War, exactly.
And working for peace and so on. And that this really, so many people couldn't go with him. In the United States, in Chicago, he was told, just stop meddling in areas you don't know about. You're not an economist. You're not a political scientist. You're not in international relations. Stick to what you know. And there were people in the movement, black and white, who felt like, oh, well, you're taking your eye off of this crucial work, which he was not. But that sort of expanding, and Harding was the one who really crystallized an understanding of him as this inconvenient hero, somebody who we revere, but he was in some ways he was too big.
Yeah. Well, I just keep wondering too, and better, so much better than I do, but I mean, the trajectory of his thought, what would Martin Luther King in the year 2015 have been like? Well,
Drew Dellinger, does some of that work. He indicates the beginnings of environmental awareness. King wrote something like, it's good to be able to sit at a lunch counter next to each other, but if the milk you're drinking has strontium 90 in it, that's not so good, right? So he's seeing it, and so he's also implicating the nuclear threat there, but also environmental toxicity and degradation. And so he would have gone there. I wonder what the gender, where he would have gone with that. And many scholars, womanist scholars, have talked about that, written about that. He would certainly have evolved because he had this enormous capacity, and he would have become more and more the great bodhisattva that Thich Nhat Hanh recognized him to be.
Yeah, that footnote that you had about Thomas Merton, Seven Storey Mountain being a dangerous book was so helpful to me, because I read it as such a young person.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder if you yourself have ever thought about being a monk. I mean, especially living with the nuns in Vietnam. I just wonder just how that whole expression of piety is whether it's been an important part of your own formation.
Monks and nuns have been very important in my life. I'm really happy to be a married person, and that's another kind of vowed life, isn't it?
Yes, that's true.
It's a vowed life,
yeah.
and really, and it's a community. But one of my most beloved spiritual directors was a Benedictine nun in Alabama, Sister Morris Allen. and I would make the trek up to Coleman to the convent where she was. She was enormously important to me. I've been blessed to make, I guess, 7 trips to Taizé, which is an ecumenical monastery. So, and I was able to meet Brother Roger. He heard about how Sheila and I and Tom Pointer and all Catherine Flowers and Fanny Davis and all these folks in Alabama were using Taizé service as an instrument of racial reconciliation down in this little white Episcopal church in Lowndes County. But what we did, we would take Taizé, so we would use these beautiful chants from France, from the Taizé community, but we would intersperse them with spirituals and hymns from the Black Christian tradition. And we opened it up to the whole community. So Black and white together, and young people and old people. And we had, then we would have a potluck meal afterwards. And that little open service that had no purpose. People would say, well, why are you doing this? You know, what's the outcome you want from this? And I would say there's no outcome. We just are waiting to see what God will do. And one evening, somebody knocked on the door, and it was Catherine Flowers and Fanny Davis, and these 2 current civil rights activists, amazing people, and they had heard about this, and they came to say, we want partnership in a project to build a new public library. Well, any case, Brother Roger had heard about this work and the use of Taizé, and he asked me to come to lunch with him and the rest of the monks, the brothers. And it was just 2 weeks before his assassination. So at the end of this lunch, which was, I felt, I was going to fly away. It was so beautiful. He knelt in front of me as a bishop and asked me to bless him. He was 90 years old at the time and one of the saintliest people in the world. And I was just weeping. And then I knelt and asked him to bless me. And then that was the last time I saw him alive. And Sheila and I were back in France for vacation after this great pilgrimage for peace in Lowndes County, right after the Taizé experience. And we flew back to France for some vacation, and then he was assassinated. So we were at his funeral. All to say, monks and nuns have played a big role in my life. And I think it's a remarkable life. And, we have quite a few expressions of monasticism in the Episcopal Church. Here in the Diocese of California, we have Franciscans, we have Gregorians, Holy Cross folks. Brother Brendan has his communion of the Mystic Rose. There's the St. Hildegard's community that I'm a visitor for down in Austin, Texas. And these women, I was the visitor for an Episcopal order, the Community of the Holy Spirit, which in New York City and up in Brewster, New York. And yeah, there are monks and nuns all through my life.
Yeah, it's cool. Another thing that's kind of related to that, I was just thinking of that section where you talked about just kind of like you call it the comparative mysticism of A.J. Muste and Howard Thurman. I wonder if you could describe that, and then just kind of describe like where you fit on that too. Like how would you describe your own kind of piety?
Well, Thurman was considered the mystic, in the civil rights movement, and part of that, there's a whole vast world of Thurman studies. He's a subject of great study in his own right, and I've just barely dipped my toe into it. But part of it was what would be called nature mysticism. Yeah. As a young person in Gulf Coast, Florida, he would go out and stand as great storms like hurricanes were coming, and just feel the power of that. And to him, it was the power of God. So he felt God, as many people do today, through nature, and especially these sublime movements, what the Romantics would call the sublime, where this great overwhelming power speaks of depth and mystery. And Muste was different. He had mystic experiences. He felt that God helped him guided him in very much the same way that Martin Luther King felt this too, that he put himself at these junctures in his life where he was really trying to struggle with being a labor activist, and whether he should, walk away from what we would call parish ministry and be out in the streets with the early labor unions, lots of violence that they were subjected to, and he felt God guided him through that. That's a good question about me, Malcolm. So I start every day with a piece of the gospel, and then I just sit with it in silence for 20 minutes, and I feel. So Thich Nhat Hanh says that at every moment of our lives we can touch the ultimate. That's how he puts it, and I can confirm that. I feel that God is as close as my beating heart, like the pulse in my arteries in my neck. I mean, in prayer, not all the time, right? This
Totally.
This is the way centering prayer is. Like
Right.
my mind wanders, and I start worrying
gotta
about
keep showing up and
all the meetings of the day, or whatever. But just that return, the practice of centering prayer, the return, and God is there, and very much through the Holy Scripture. I feel that God's presence is in it. So this is not about inerrancy or infallibility or anything like that, but rather that there is a living quality to these sacred scriptures, especially the Gospels. That's where I spend my time. I was taught that every sermon for an Episcopal sermon should be an amalgam, a synthesis of all the pieces of the lectionary, right? So all three scripture readings, the psalm, and the collect, and if I were a better student of my teachers at Virginia Seminary, I would be doing that every week. But I do read all those things, but essentially it's this powerful witness from the gospel, and I just feel the presence of God in it every week.
Yeah, that's really cool. So we take questions from our audience still. And one question's already come in. This is the question. Does the body of Christ include all the saints of all faiths and the material world? A communion of subjects, not a collection of objects, as Father Thomas Berry famously said. So that's the question that came in. I can't wait to hear what you do with it. It's perfect for this week after All Saints Day.
Truly perfect. So I would say yes, because those people who are living in the cloud of witness, that great cloud, the creedal differences between them, like between Presbyterians and Roman Catholics, or between breakaway parts of the Anglican Church and the Episcopal Church, clearly those have gone away. I mean, we can see that immediately. We know those are such artificial and actually deforming barriers between us. I think it doesn't take too much of the religious imagination to be able to understand that even greater seeming barriers dissolve in the light of God's love. And so the bodhisattvas of Buddhism and the saints of Christianity are going to be partners in the beloved community with us, with all of life. And our presiding bishop, Michael Curry, is just this past Saturday, when he was preaching, as he did in Grace Cathedral 5 years ago, he's expanded his way of thinking and speaking about the family of God. So it used to be people, and now it's all of life. And so in terms of the viewer's question, it's not only all of life that's physically present on the globe at this moment, it's all of life. As we know from the Hebrew scriptures, God is the God of the living, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who had been long dead when this was spoken by God to Moses, but they were alive as the New Testament revisits that. They're alive to God. So yes, all those, they'll all be in there together. They are all in there together, along with our dogs and cats. I'll just
Yeah,
go ahead and say
completely.
that.
Gosh, we love this. They're part of our family, exactly.
Yeah.
And what a great thing to be living with another being who experiences the world, and we're experiencing some of the same things, and some things are different. And it's
And we
nice to
learn
be
from
introduced
that.
to that.
And we learn
That's why I
from
love
that.
your stories about just your connection to horses. Do you know what I mean? Like that was a great way to learn that truth.
Yeah.
The dolphin that I'm surfing with is
Mm,
having a
I
different experience than I am, and yet what we're
so
attracted to is
important.
that energy that you described.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've been dying to ask you this the whole time that we've been going on, which is just about how COP26 is going, and
Mm,
then what's surprising you and what you're seeing, and then just signs of the beloved community, because it just seems like that is a project that humanity needs to undertake, and being in a beloved community and understanding our participation in that beloved community seems
yeah.
so central to that project.
So we're deep. Thank you for that question. So important. As both President Biden and Special Ambassador Kerry have said, this is and others have repeated, COP26, the UN Climate Summit going on in Glasgow right now, is the planet's last great chance. And here's specifically what they mean by that. If we don't increase and make accountable our commitments, not to the long term, like some countries have said now, they'll go zero, carbon neutral by 2070 or 2050. No, by 2030. This is our chance to do that. And if that happens, and they're deep in the negotiations, almost at the end of the COP now, if they do that, we could prevent sort of unmeasurable suffering. And not only for the end of the century, within our lifetime, within the next 2 decades, unmeasurable suffering. And we could prevent that. So that's the collective effort. That's why this COP is so important. Every country, 196 countries, were asked to bring more higher ambition in terms of their nationally determined contribution to the overall effort to take greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. And we know that the way this marvelous planet works is that these feedback loops mean that the accumulating carbon dioxide and the oxygen in the atmosphere it keeps multiplying itself. So it's showing up faster, in the effects of climate change, of warming, are showing up faster than many models expected them to, and more drastically. And we've been living with this, of course, with these fires here in California and in the Pacific Northwest, where California Fire has said that almost every town's fire plans for evacuation and safety are inadequate, because the fires we're dealing with are not the fires of even 3 years ago. They're another character. So this is what's happening. So there were some very, very encouraging things happening last week. The big commitments around finance, many from private sector commitments to international climate finance and forests. Tremendous commitments by more than 100 countries for that. But at the very same time, you've got really strong critics, and including from the faith communities, saying there's no mechanism of accountability for many of these. There are promises that are way too far out. As they point out, the people who are making these negotiations are not even going to be alive in many cases by 2070. So how sincere are these? We need to be coming back every year in terms of accountability, not every 5 years. So there's a lot riding on these next few days. The other big piece that's important for the Episcopal Church is how we reduce the greenhouse gases, like who is present for this. So women are still very much underrepresented in these discussions. Indigenous people are very much underrepresented. And of course, climate change is affecting Black, brown people, women all over the world. The leading edge of climate change is already affecting these people so much more than it is comfortable people in the most developed countries, men and more prosperous people. So the Episcopal Church is really raising its voice and saying, we need to be doing this in a just way. So this, the whole rising consciousness about racial justice has its intersection with eco-justice, and what we're trying to keep along with our partners. And one of the really encouraging things about beloved community about this is that we just get along. So the interfaith community, we're just working beautifully together and have been for years. Our partners are not only ecumenical, that is within the Christian world, but they're interfaith, and we learn from each other, different emphases, different initiatives, and we're all like, oh, that's good, I can learn from that. And we're working with civil society. So here in the United States, we are calling it a whole society approach, where every sector is necessary to make this commitment. And the religious bodies, my argument is that we have particular things to offer. Each sector has things to offer to the overall effort that nobody else has exactly to offer. And ours might be moral authority and the focus on justice, but also the ability to work from the ground up, from grassroots, like transforming our lives and the lives of our community. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's so inspiring just hearing the word about it. And, I do think, and I think you're the first person who told me, there's a kind of an opportunity here that human beings have never had to really coordinate in a way that's global before. And
it's a first.
It's a first. It's a first. It's a first. One of the things that I loved about the book too is just about friendship. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about kind of like your philosophy of friendship, or kind of how your ideas of friendship were kind of refined by these two people who come from such different worlds, Thich Nhat Hanh, Martin Luther King, and just kind of like what you learned about friendship from your study, these two figures.
Well, thank you, Malcolm. I did poke around in the philosophy of friendship for this book in the research, and found something pretty startling, which is that there's a line, that's not surprising, of philosophic inquiry into the nature of friendship, but in some ways it hasn't been updated since some Roman Empire period.
Right, Nicomachean ethics.
Yeah, that and so the categories of Roman thought, philosophic thought, are not. A lot has happened.
Yeah, right.
In the intervening 2,000 years, right? And so Aristotle and those ethics. But what would we say about friendship now in the light of this with the beloved community? I think where we'd have to go is the idea of agape love, and that the kind of friendship that King and Nhat Hanh share together even today is not what the Greeks would call philia. It includes that. It's inclusive of that, like good friends, but it's more agape. So I translate that, as you know, as overflowing love. It's sometimes called sacrificial love, and that's not wrong. And it's sometimes called unconditional love, and that too is right. But I think more evocatively, it's overflowing love, and the character of a friendship that's based on that, well, that has just infinite capacity to grow and to grow, because it's grounded in the love in the universe. It's not sort of my power or yours. All the kinds of love that are connected to it, eros and the friendship of puppies together, and friends, as we call friends. That's all there, all important. And there's work in each of those areas to understand and do those properly and beautifully. But friendship that's grounded on overflowing love that comes out of that's a different quality, and it means friendship with God as well.
Yeah, I mean, you taught me so much about friendship, and especially in this book too, just like how generative a friendship can be in changing all of our lives. I can't believe that the time has run out. I've got a zillion questions. I wanted to ask you about Josiah Royce. I wanted to ask you about personalism. I wanted to ask you about the influence of California on some of these ideas.
I think you know more about all those things than I do.
No way.
Yeah.
I guess that's the way life is, though. It's like to be continued is like the main thing.
Yeah.
But we're so grateful to have you tonight. It's actually our last forum of the fall season. So all of our viewers should watch for announcements about the winter season, which will be coming up in January.
You get such incredible guests to the forum, Malcolm. You really do a great service to the Bay Area and more broadly by bringing really, really wonderful people, excluding me, but really good. And so thank you for that. I look forward to the programming for the next season.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we rely on, for everybody watching, we rely on your support for the forum. Gifts of any size make a difference. You can give on gracecathedral.org or by texting THINK, THINK to 76278. And what a blessing. We can't wait to read your play or whatever it is that you discovered.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, if I could just say, there is a play, as you know, that Thich Nhat Hanh wrote.
I love that.
That has never been performed, and I'm working right now to get that performed and filmed. So
great.
Yeah,
well, that was my first natural thing. I actually had a question on that too, among the big list. But Thich Nhat Hanh wrote a play that you've studied so carefully and did a great job of just giving us a picture of it. Even just the context. I needed the history around it in order to be able to understand what the driving forces were for the people in the play.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we're going to all be oriented more towards theater, I think, for a little bit.
Thank you, Malcolm.
Yeah, and thanks so much for joining us, Bishop Marc. And thanks everybody for watching, and we'll see you in the winter. Good night, everybody.
Bye.